welcome to Revelation TV. Tonight we are discussing a very important subject. There's a very great divide on this issue, which we could call a debate if we had two debaters in the studio. Education, should it be secular or Christian? What is best for children in the modern world? And to debate this subject, I'm very pleased that Dr. Joseph Boot is the founder of the Ezra Institute, and here in the UK, the Ezra Centre for Christian Thought. And you've founded a classical Christian school in Canada. Was it called the Ezra School?
No, it was called Westminster Classical Christian Academy in Toronto.
And you've been involved with founding new Christian schools here in the UK. So welcome.
Great to be on the show. Thanks for having me, Tim.
Wonderful. And very brave of you also to come when the counterpart who was going to be arguing for secular education unfortunately pulled out at the last minute. He's actually quite a prominent public advocate for secular education. I won't embarrass him by saying his name, but only to say we're sad that we don't have the alternative view, not least because they are so vociferous in campaigning for secular education. I spoke to their office earlier in the week and said, why don't you want to argue publicly and be subjected to public scrutiny? But sadly, you've got me, Joseph, tonight to present some of their arguments, why they are arguing for secular education. And we've got at least 9 or 10 points that we can go through. Mm-hmm. It's not going to therefore be an Oxford Union debate, but I feel we can start with you presenting the case and for Christian education, and then we can discuss the case for secular education. And just to say, this is an interactive program, so I'm hoping very much that you, our viewers, will email in during this live broadcast. Of course, it will be available also on the catch-up TV and on YouTube in the future. So we'll read all the decent emails and text contributions, and if you have questions or comments on the subject on either side of the divide, please do engage. And we'll stack up all of, so if you don't hold in there, don't think, oh no, my email or text hasn't been read yet. We'll stack them up and we'll put them to Dr. Boot later in the show. But shall we start by looking at the positive case for Christian education?
Sure.
You have the floor.
Well, first of all, it is disappointing that the other side of the discussion weren't willing to show on the day, because what becomes clear in the interaction around the question of education is that this is an issue of world and life view. This is a conflict. This is in a sense, there's an antithesis here of world and life views. It was T.S. Eliot who said, we derive our theory of education from our philosophy of life. So although it's very easy to want to go straight to the nuts and bolts or the mechanics of the process of education, curriculum, although even that word curriculum is interesting because it's cognate with the word to run. It literally means a race course. So the curriculum is the course laid out, and that course that you're going to lay out for somebody to study is rooted in the religious worldview, actually, of the people who are designing the program. And so that's the point, of course, of debate and of discussion, is that somebody can lay out their world and life view, and how that should inform the educational process in their view, and then the Christian is able to lay out their perspective and why the curricula should follow a Christian course, as it were.
Yeah, and it is really important for the future of any society or civilization. So this isn't a small issue.
No.
How children are brought up, and of course is it Proverbs 22, it says that, train up a child in the way he should go,
yeah.
or whichever way they go in, they won't depart from it. So it'll influence them for the rest of their lives, and they, of course, will influence the future.
Yeah. Well, you mentioned that this humanist organization, you said, is vociferous in promoting their perspective. Well, there is a good reason for that. It's because it's rooted in their worldview convictions, and all worldviews, will come to this in just a second, but all worldviews are fundamentally religiously founded. The Humanist Manifesto, too, back in the 1970s, made very clear that secular humanism is a religious worldview. Because those who control the minds of the young, or shape the minds of the young, govern the course of the future, education is a battleground. Because if you're shaping minds, shaping thoughts, shaping the hearts of people, you're actually shaping the course of the future. So it's actually a battle over what the future is going to look like. And that's actually useful to mention that in the context of the transition from pagan education in the West to Christian education. So you've got two different religious worldviews. You've got in the...
It's interesting you said transition from pagan to Christian, because I see it very much in my lifetime as transition from Christian to pagan.
Yes, well, that's what's happened now.
Okay.
But when we go back to the beginning, if we're going to talk about...
Okay, yeah, give us a bit of history.
If we're going to talk about Western education
yeah.
And its root, then we have to talk about the initial transition from a pagan perspective to a distinctly Christian perspective, which of course begins in the 1st century. And let's remember that when we think about religious worldviews, that word religion, which the humanists band around all the time, but they never actually define. I mean, the origin of the word religion, religio or religere, it probably means to tie or to bind. The Latin root means to tie or to bind, and it concerned the direction of society. What is it that binds people together and gets them moving in the same direction? That's why in either side of this debate, people want consistency in education, because they have an interest in seeing people bound together in a common concern, a common interest. And religion is ultimately, the bottom line, ultimate concern. Yeah. That's what it's about, ultimate concerns. And so
I know we're going to get into the detail, but I'm trying to put the other side before you've even presented the one. But you know, they would say, "Oh no, we're not trying to tie any. We're actually wanting everyone to be open and free and not tied."
That's why they don't want faith schools.
Well, you see, exactly.
Exactly. Yeah. So, you know, we can certainly...
As a PSHE teacher once said to me, it's wrong to make moral judgments.
Exactly. There's a self-contradiction involved in their desire to shut down a Christian approach to education. They're demonstrating that, no, what they want is the total domination. There's a totalitarian impulse there, a totalizing impulse to control the field. Now, if you go back to the origins of what we call in the West the liberal arts education, we have to go back to the pagan world. And in the 1st century, the academies, the education was, of course, only for a small elite. And it was rooted in the schools or the academies of the philosophers in the Greco-Roman world. Yeah. And there was a change that took place with the advent of the Christian faith and the miracle of the birth of Christianity. I mean, when you think about it, 120 people on the day of Pentecost in the upper room, 12 disciples now, 120 people gathered in the upper room, and by 325 AD, the emperor of Rome...
I thought you were going to say 325 PM, there were 3,000 on the day of Pentecost.
That was true on the day of Pentecost.
Yeah, go on, 325 AD.
So you start with, around 30 AD. You fast forward 300 years, and the Christians have been preaching the good news about Christ over against the ideas of the pagan gods, a chaotic universe, fate. And not just the fatalism of some of the Greek philosophy, but the gods of Olympus and some of the ideals and the idealism and the Stoic philosophy of the ancient world. Christianity is coming into a collision course with that. And yet by 325 AD, actually this year is the 1700th
That's really interesting.
anniversary
Perfect.
of the Council of Nicaea this year,
Amazing.
where the Emperor Constantine called the council at his own expense. They'd been historically persecuting Christians, and at his own expense he calls a council because he himself has become a Christian, to bring the bishops from all over the known world together to ensure that they have summarized Orthodox Christian faith. Now, what's been going on is that actually the first appearance of a Christian school is in the 2nd century in Alexandria. The origin of education actually in the West is based on the synagogue model of the Jews that was largely taken over by the church. Children in the synagogue, because the Hebrews believed in the importance of reading and writing, because Christianity is a book-oriented faith, right? In order to understand the meaning of the world, of creation, of God's order, structure, and so forth, you need to be able to read. And so the Jewish children studied in the synagogue schools, and there would have been writing and arithmetic, and then the study of Torah, which literally is law or instruction. This model was basically taken over by the early church. It was adapted in terms of some of the insights of the Greco-Roman model of education. And by the 2nd century, you've got a converted Stoic founding one of the earliest Christian academies for young people. They're studying the philosophers of the ancient world, they're studying the academic disciplines, and they're studying it in the context of a Christian world and life view of Christian commitment. In a very short space of time, these...
And now, could you, because I know in the early church there was quite a conflict, or an emerging conflict, the church fathers and, let's say, Judaism. But could we say that even in those early stages it was a Judeo-Christian model, or is that like a more modern term?
Well, that's a contemporary term that actually tries to describe, it's a way of trying to describe Western civilization, that it has emerged from Hebraic roots. Those are, of course, reinforced very much at the Reformation in the 16th century, and end of the 15th and the 16th century. And so when we speak about a Judeo-Christian understanding, most people mean by that a recognition that there is a God who has an order, design, and structure for reality that we discover. And so that kind of a model began to be taught in the early centuries. The Christians began their own schools, and very quickly the pagan schools became defunct. People looked at the Christian schools, they saw their success, and they wanted their children to go there. And so gradually the pagan schools died off. Became obsolete. Later on, they eventually became illegal. So that was the sort of beginnings of things in the ancient world. Now, what's really important for understanding modern Western education is how we got the educational system that we have today from those early beginnings, because then you enter into the Middle Ages, the early Middle, and then eventually, of course, the High Middle Ages. Now, the Middle Ages are important because this is the age of the monastery. This is the age of origins of words like the library and the scriptorium, because again, Christianity is a word-based faith. It's not about mystics wandering out into the desert to contemplate. It's not about mere private meditation or ecstatic experience. It's a word-based faith. And the Newer Testament is written in Greek. The Older Testament is in Hebrew. So it means the mastery of various languages. And the monasteries start copying the great texts of the ancient world. They're also transmitting the text of Scripture. Eventually, these monasteries have huge...
And then translating into Latin, and that was like the main liturgical language.
Exactly. And yes, this is in the West. It's in the East, it's Greek, but in the Western part of the empire, it's Latin.
That's right. And
these monasteries are preserving the learning of the ancient world, and not just Christian learning, pagan learning also. And they're building up these great libraries, they're copying manuscripts, and they're having a teaching function in the Western world. And the monastery, giving us, as I say, the library, the scriptorium and so forth, is actually the foundations of what we called our parish school system. The monasteries were the origin of the parish school system. And more than that, the highest achievement of medieval Europe, of Christian Europe, of what we used to call Christendom, and some people who have that memory still do, was the university. The university was a Christian development in Western Europe. The word university means unity, versity in diversity. And what was the unity in this diversity of studies? And the answer of Western Europe was, it is God and his revelation.
Can I interject? Because I've been doing a little bit of research on the internet with the help of friends, and you're triggering so many of these arguments, these charges against Christian and faith education, and you're using buzzwords like diversity, and unity and cohesion, bringing people together, and it's there, you're saying, embedded in the early days of the formation of education, Christian education.
Exactly, because whether it was elementary education and the school system that was beginning to develop, or the university itself. And again, we have to remember that in a word-based faith means reading, writing. Now, it's a little while, we'll come to it in a moment, before we start to see what we might call universal education. So education is for the educated classes, the wealthier classes. It's the feudal system, of course, in medieval Europe.
And some scholarships, so some merit-based.
Yes, that's starting to emerge. Yeah. And the question for the university is, well, what is it that gives that in all these different studies, right, in mathematics and geometry and literature, and of course for the Western curriculum, the 7 liberal arts, what is it that unifies them, brings them together? And the answer was God, and therefore theology. So theology was called the Queen of the Sciences, the Queen of the Sciences, because it was that Christian idea of God and his order for all of creation that made sense of and gave a sense of integrity and unity to the diverse subjects. Think about it this way. Think about it's Alfred North Whitehead, the great English philosopher, mathematician, who said that it was impossible to imagine the emergence of the sciences without the medieval insistence on the rationality of God. The pagan world believed in chance, in chaos, in fate, much like the modern evolutionary worldview.
There's not much to discover if what you're looking for is chaos.
Right,
you're not
chance
actually
gives you the idea of a brute fact, right? Okay. The brute fact is an uncreated, uninterpreted, raw piece of data that the human mind has to come to in some kind of original way. Well, there's no way of relating that raw piece of isolated data to anything else without a broad framework. Think about it this way, this maybe help the viewer. Before there was the PlayStation, there was join the dot puzzles.
Yeah.
And you remember the join the dot puzzle?
I do, but I don't know what a PlayStation is, but don't worry about that.
Or an Xbox.
I'm sure our viewers will know fully what it is.
Sony PlayStation, I don't know, what are the other
I've heard of
gaming systems, right, whatever they are.
I've shunned it.
These days, anyway. And a join the dot puzzle was a very simple thing. You open the book, dots on a page, seems like a random selection of dots. Sometimes there might be a number next to the dot to show you the order to join it in. And the basic idea is teach a child how to draw and discover shapes. It's a house, it's a car, it's a giraffe, when they join up the dots.
It's a letter.
Exactly. And the reason a join the dot puzzle works, rather than it just being a random collection of dots, is that there's an author to the puzzle. So when the child gets that pencil and comes to the dots and connects them, it's not random, it's not chance. These dots are there by design, so they discover the meaning that's already there. They don't invent the meaning, they discover the meaning. Now when we look at the world, and this is the way the Christians have always understood it, when we come to the world, and this what we do in education is we come to all these different facets of reality, the dimensions of reality, and the Christian says, well, these haven't been thrown up by the womb of chance. This isn't a join the dot puzzle with no author. When we come to reality, we discover the meaning that's already there. We discover mathematical law. Yeah. We discover physical law. We call it physics. We discover a biotic law. We call it biology. We discover logical law. We call it logic. We discover lingual laws. We study languages. So we actually we're discovering a meaning that's already there. This was over against the pagan view, which was basically saying, well, maybe there's some ideas in some invisible, transcendent, eternal realm that we don't know about, but essentially the human mind must impose its meaning on a chaotic reality. And the vehicle to do that in the ancient world, to impose order in the chaos, was the state. Well, as we've been repaganizing, we emphasize now more and more in the West, in a way we never used to, the state.
State control.
State control.
Yeah.
So you get to medieval Europe, you've got...
we've only got to medieval Europe.
Yep.
Speed up.
And I'll speed it up.
No, don't speed up too much, because we haven't got another debater, so you've got the floor.
That's why they've given me the floor, so it's tough on them.
Yeah.
So medieval Europe gives us the university. Then we have the importance of the Reformation. Because generally within Roman Catholicism in the West, in the Latin Church prior to the Reformation, it was the clergy who were educated. They were the ones that read. The Bible was still in Latin. It hadn't been translated into the vernacular, to the common tongue of ordinary people. And so you have early translations like Wycliffe's Bible translation in English. But of course then Martin Luther translates the New Testament into German. And the Reformation emphasizes not the clergy as such, or the priestly class, but ordinary people. And it says, butcher, baker, candlestick maker, we need to put the Bible, these early reformers said, in the hands of every plowboy. This will be the basis of freedom, liberty, and a true education for everyone.
And it was a vehicle for bringing, language to nations.
Indeed.
So you've mentioned Wycliffe, Tyndale, but then Jan Hus, and the Czech language, is largely attributed to his work.
Yes. Yeah, it's amazing that actually the contribution of Bible translation. Think of the Geneva Bible, and then later on, of course, the King James Bible. Its contribution to English literature and to the development of the English language. But at any rate, people are now beginning to read the scriptures in their own language, and the Reformation, as people are able to come to scripture for themselves and reflect on God's word, breaks out, and with it a massive outbreak of learning, literacy, and the development of academies. We haven't got time to talk about them all, of course, but...
you never know, we might, but keep going.
One example.
I'm seeing some emails coming in, so people are really enjoying this. So,
okay, good.
Just to say that if you want to make any comment on anything, past, present, what we're talking about now, or further into the program, please just email me, text me. Got the number on the screen. Carry on, Joe.
Well, you have, for example, the emergence of the Academy in Geneva of John Calvin, and there is a Brit who goes over there, a Scotsman, John Knox, who goes over and studies under Calvin, and he brings back from Geneva
Am I right to say the Geneva Bible basically came about from the scholars who were ejected during the Elizabethan period, if I'm right?
Yes, yes.
Because they... and all that scholarship was concentrated in Geneva, and then, so it's persecuted clergymen.
Yes, and it's a translation, and it's got commentary, and actually some of the commentary caused quite the stir, because the Bible does not support the idea of absolute monarchy or a divine right of kings, and puts the law above the king, and so there was frustration with and opposition to, in many cases, the Geneva Bible. But at any rate, this emphasis on people being able to read, being able to write for themselves, being able to read script, and of everybody becoming literate, so that you weren't reliant on stained glass windows to tell you the story of the Gospels and listening to a mass in Latin, but now you could actually participate meaningfully.
And one other thing about the Geneva Bible, I'm fairly sure that was the Bible that was taken by the early the Puritans who went and founded America.
Yes, so
I think it was a copy of the Geneva Bible.
Yeah, it was very important to the Puritans.
Yeah.
John Knox, who I mentioned, is considered the father of the Puritans, of English Puritanism, and he brings back to Scotland a vision for universal education. And in fact, universal free education. And he emphasizes this to the Scottish Parliament. The Scottish Parliament becomes Protestant, Calvinistic, and he gives birth, effectively, Knox gives birth to Puritanism. And the Puritans, contrary to myth, are not this group of prudes trying to cancel fun. They believe in the arts and in education. And for example, Oliver Cromwell, who, in the mid-17th century, with the Cromwellian protectorate, he was passionate about starting elementary schools and indeed universities. He was actually the effective founder of Durham University. And you mentioned the Puritans in the Americas. Yeah. They were the founders of Harvard. Yeah. If you look at and of course Princeton, remember the universities when they were founded were places set up originally to train clergy. Yeah, so when people say, in the West, education is secular, that has no relevance whatsoever to the foundations of education in the Western world or in Britain at all. Secular means literally of this world. In other words, has no relevance at all or bearing. God has no bearing at all on the education and the needs of human life or human society. Well, that bears no relationship to the history of the Western world whatsoever. And so the Puritans emphasized education, founded universities. The early rules of Harvard talk about laying Christ at the foundation of education. So that we, the motto of the University of Oxford, do you know what it is?
I do know there's Jesus College, there's Christ Church, there's a lot of Christianity in those buildings.
But the motto of the university is "The Lord is my light."
That's right.
Taken from the Psalms.
Right.
The Cavendish Physics Laboratory at Cambridge says over the top, great are the works of the Lord, studied by all those who delight in them. Yeah. And so if you look at the 16th and 17th century and all of the great founders of what we call modern science, which is another, frankly, twaddle that the secular humanists talk about, Christianity being anti-science and everything else. No, the modern empirical method, the sciences were born in the lap of Christian education, specifically because of the Western view of God, order, law, structure. Creation could be studied, experiments could be done. We would expect regularity, order, pattern, structure in a way that even the ancient Greeks didn't. It didn't occur to them to do experiments, but it did in the Christian West. And so these great universities are grounded and founded in the vision of God. And so we had the parish school system. In England, we have all of these schools cropping up everywhere.
Church schools,
the parish school system, and private Christian institutions. The state was not involved, which is another anomaly, which is the state only gets involved in education in England and Wales towards the end of the 19th century. Yeah. The state is the Johnny-come-lately to education, and it saw the success of the church, and it tried to copy the church's model. Now, we can have maybe a longer discussion about that.
And the other thing that 100-odd years ago, the Balfour Education Act was taking all these non-conformist schools that were funded sacrificially by Christians in their churches, taking them into state control.
Yes.
So not only there's the official church schools, but all the other schools were swept into. And fair to say it was a Christian country in those days, so it didn't seem so threatening.
That is the critical point, because you see the same thing happening at the round about the same time in Canada and in the United States, is that as the view of what the state should be doing, basically because of humanist philosophers in the latter part of the 19th century and some of their utopian ideals, the idea of the function and role of the state begins to expand and grow exponentially, of course, to the point now where we're billions of pounds in debt and hopelessly, the welfare states of Europe are collapsing. What's our solution? Well, why don't we slap VAT on private schools and institutions that have historically always been recognized as charitable? But the state was the latecomer to any form of involvement in education. And actually, as you look at the 20th century, what we see is the decline in educational standards. Yeah. You talk to if I talk to my parents, my grandparents, if you look at any of the major studies on this, we've seen for a long time declining educational standards. We as a country are falling behind much of the rest of the world. And
that is not as a result of all of this great heritage of Christian education. No. It's a more recent experiment of secular humanist education.
Precisely. What happened is what we might call progressive philosophers, progressive thinkers in education, Horace Mann, John Dewey in North America and others, began to want to throw over the liberal arts, the Christian liberal arts tradition, and a broadly Christian education, and replace it with so-called progressive notions of education which don't have a Christian view of the human person, regard the past as something to be liberated from rather than to appreciate and to learn from, and basically saw any role for God or revelation as a hindrance to man realizing himself and his own freedom. And so that's where the change begins to take place. But it's critical to mention what you said, which is that most people did not see some predicted it, some saw it, but most people didn't see the risk of the state taking over education when the state was so explicitly Christian. And so, and right through my education in England, in government schools, it was mandated that there be a Christian act of worship regularly, weekly in the life of schools. There was a sense that we sang hymns, we said prayers. There was a place for God, design, order, structure, morality, ethics in the classroom.
There's basically been a revolution.
There's been a revolution.
So we're now reverting back to this.
To a pagan model. A neo-pagan model. Obviously, we see the universities captured basically in the 1960s. You got the social revolution, the sexual revolution, and we're still in the tail end of that right now, and everything is falling apart around our ears. Yeah. 1 in 4 Scots today are functionally illiterate.
So Scotland really pioneered education before the rest of the country.
Yes, it did.
I'm not allowed to say the rest of the country. Apologies to those who are
the rest of what is Great Britain
Scottish,
today.
Exactly.
Over 5 million adults in Britain today are functionally illiterate.
Yeah, it's unbelievable.
And you talk to university professors, whether they're in Canada, England, or the United States, and they'll tell you, they get students arriving at university, and they can't write coherent sentences increasingly. There's a whole bunch of reasons for that, but the idea that, or what guarantees a quality education is a secular humanistic state in government schools is absolutely a myth. It's one of the reasons.
Isn't that almost we're going to get into the weeds in a minute, but isn't that almost the only way they can pull it off is by it being enforced?
Of course. If you give people school choice, what do? I mean, if you look at the most successful schools, even in the public sector, very often they're church-associated schools. Parents are desperate to get into those catchment areas to get their kids into those kinds of schools.
Now by the way, you're really getting into the debate issue, which is what is good for children in modern Britain. But you've given us a brilliant backcloth, and I'm afraid I will never be the devil's advocate, I have to say that, but if I was to look, as I have, for an equivalence depth of backcloth, I couldn't find it, with all the support of AI on the internet. But what I can do is present the arguments. So if we can switch and flip now, and I present some of the arguments in favour of secular education. And I think to make it a more interesting programme, because I'll make a mess of it if I try to be the advocate, but I'll present their arguments. And to be honest, I don't see many positive, but I see quite a number of arguments against Christian and faith education. So I'll give them a fair shot and I'll allow you to answer them. But the first slate that we're putting up, these are basically from an AI search of what is the humanist case for secular education. And the first one that I've got up is not necessarily in order, but it's this. Their objective is to abolish religious selection. A faith school should not be permitted to select pupils based on their religion, as this leads to social division, inequality, and discrimination. So I think we may as well go through them one by one and answer the detail of that argument. Would it be a good thing now to abolish religious selection? And we may as well bring in quite early on the Islamic schools that seem to be proliferating around the Western world as well. So maybe that's the root of their concern. But what do you think of that as an argument? After all that you've said about, the layers and layers of Christian education over the centuries, they're saying, let's just get rid.
Well, if you want an atheistic, humanistic society, then of course it's in your interest to abolish competition in education, selection in education, diversity of choice in education. Now, the last time I checked, the West prided itself in being a free society. We're seeing that being eroded. If part of the question is this: who is the first educator? Who is actually responsible for children? Now, the modern state has basically said the state effectively owns the children. I mean, I actually had a government department in Canada write to me and tell me as much when I wrote to them about the education system. But from a Christian standpoint, and in the history of the Western world, it's not the state that guides a child's education, it's the parents.
But even from a secular perspective, after the Second World War, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights said that you've got to protect against the state, irrespective of religious persuasion or
protect against the state or against parents.
You should protect children from the state.
Yes,
you should be protect parents' rights against an encroaching state.
Yeah. And that's a huge danger. So what these humanists are essentially saying is that the state owns the children. The parents should not have choice. There shouldn't be liberty in regard to education. The government wants to indoctrinate your children in a secular, humanistic, religious philosophy. Now, they, of course, say, well, their education is neutral. We'll maybe come to that in a moment. That's a myth, too. We'll come to that. But
they're guarding in this argument, they're guarding against social division, inequality and discrimination. But how's that in the eyes of the beholder?
How's that going? They've secularized the schools. They've done it really, it's been in process since the 1960s and 70s. We've had 50 years of this. How is this removal of division and discrimination going? Not at all.
It seems to be increasing.
It's increasing.
If the Southport riots were anything to go by.
Precisely. So their vision of things isn't working. Now, we can address the question of Islam, which is I'm not here to defend the notion of Islamic schools, madrasas, and those things, because that isn't part of the Western tradition. We're talking about England.
Haven't the left-wing liberals been trying to impose it on our tradition?
Yes, they
have.
It's
caused a division.
That's why we have much of the division today, because the bottom line is, if you want to come and live in Britain and be welcomed into the United Kingdom, then you live under the law structure and the constitutional Christian character of Britain, and that means a broadly Christian education. It wasn't so that the foundations of a Christian a liberal society, classically liberal society, we might say, or conservative society, be uprooted by a completely foreign conception of God, human nature, marriage, identity, law, and so on, which Islam represents. So yes, if you introduce Islamic schools into the historically Christian West, you're introducing a radically rival concept that doesn't value things like freedom of speech, freedom of conscience, freedom of religion in the same way. If you doubt it, go to Riyadh, go to Saudi Arabia, or get on a plane and go to Pakistan or Indonesia, go to an Islamic country and look at the system there, look at the political situation there, look at the freedoms of people there. So those who are concerned about Islamic schools have a valid point. But there you're talking about something that is not inherent in the British tradition, in the Western tradition, the liberal arts tradition. It's something completely different. Islam and the Islamic worldview didn't give birth to Western institutions. I could easily get onto a debate about the supposed Andalusian paradise in Spain and all of that.
Yeah.
That's not the point of the discussion, but we understand the issue there. But fundamentally, they've introduced.
That's what I was going to say.
The
it is
vision,
part of their experiments.
Exactly. Multiculturalism.
They've been in the driving seat.
Yeah, multiculturalism fundamentally means many gods, many religions, and the secularists have been the ones who have driven that. And of course, the neo-Marxism that has pushed the atheistic, materialistic idea of man, and that we divide the world into oppressors and oppressed, and has fed the idea of privilege, division, class warfare. It's stoked all of that, and what you end up with is VAT on private schools, because it's class hatred, it's class warfare, it's envy, and it's the politics of division.
And it's double tax, because all of the parents who pay for their children
Glad you pointed that out.
to go to private schools are already paying for all of the state.
Well, that's
system
forgotten.
as well.
That's forgotten in the debate, though, isn't it?
Yeah,
It's forgotten in the discussion that those people have already paid tax, and that they've already paid for the state system, and they're also making space in the state system for other students because they're putting their child in a private
Can I make
school.
a comment which might appear cynical, but how convenient to have an intolerant Sharia model to use as an argument to say that you should get rid of all faith schools. So, the very people that have introduced these intolerant schools are now saying, using it as a case
now we must get rid of all
study.
faith-based schools.
Yeah, very interesting.
Of course, I would argue very quickly, Tim, that every school is a faith-based school.
Yeah.
Right. Government schools, if in their model, the humanistic model, secular humanism. No, that is a religious school.
It's not tolerant. It's dogmatic.
It's dogmatic.
So the second slate that we can put up on the screen really follows on from what we're saying, but it's an argument for inclusive education. Secular education is inclusive. All children, regardless of their background, should be taught together in an environment where critical thinking and evidence-based education are emphasized. So the implication is that faith schools do not include critical thinking and are not evidence-based. What is your thought on that, sir?
Well, this is where we get into the absolute philosophical mumbo-jumbo of these people, I'm afraid. Who are not self-critical, they're not aware enough of their own dogmatism to really realize, I think, even what they're saying. Now, of course, if you have a situation where you've got Islam trying to segregate people in the schools, we've got an issue. Although I would say that historically, my mum went to a girls' school. Yeah, I
went to a boys' school. Can't you see I'm completely dysfunctional?
As a result.
Car crash of an education.
Right. So, and actually, if you look at the preponderance of girls in university now over boys, so, actually boys and girls have slightly different learning styles. And so the emphasis, I would say, the feminization of the education system in the last 40, 50 years has not only brought this sort of the the dial to the middle. The pendulum now has swung the other way, and it's boys who are struggling in school and are struggling to get the university places. They're dominated by the girls now, and that's partly because the learning styles are different. We have this ridiculous assumption that our grandparents were ignorant about these things, but no, they understood this. Learning styles are different, and actually, in many cases, boys will learn better, more effectively with other boys in the classroom and girls with girls, not to mention all the distractions of adolescence that are there. Now, I'm not saying that that's the only way to do it.
Funnily enough, though, again, private co-ed schools, that tends to even out more than what you're describing. But in the mass of the state, what Americans would call public schools, I think you're right. There is that complete underachievement.
This disparity, yes, there is. So yeah, I'm not pushing the case for separating there, but I'm saying that isn't necessarily anti-diversity. Now, on the point about critical thinking, this is absurd. If you look at the Christian classical tradition in particular, critical thinking, a foundation of, the school I founded in Toronto, grammar, logic, rhetoric, that's the pattern of the curriculum, ancient, medieval, modern, as you look at literature and history and all the various subjects. So you have this paradigm for education. Well, that was, up until my grandparents, that was the fundamental model in education. That developed critical thinkers, lifelong learners, people who are able to learn for themselves beyond their formal education, competent to read complex text, focus on it. We're seeing, of course, now with the use of all these devices and digital screens and everything else, that young people are losing the ability to focus reading on complex text and sustain concentration and sustain argument. So, no, the humanistic education has done the opposite of produce critical thinkers. And we've seen actually a deterioration of educational standards under their model in government schools. Even the attempt of some on the left to get rid of even grammar schools, which has been a real travesty. When I went to school in the comp, grammar had been abolished.
Yeah.
They weren't even teaching grammar. I had to learn my grammar in seminary while I was trying to learn, ancient Greek.
It's not easy to play catch up.
No, it's hard to play catch up.
But they also, we'll be going on to this in more detail later on the subject of creation, but they're saying, look, secular education is evidence-based.
Yeah.
What's your thought? Sorry, I've got to be careful not to smile because I'll be completely messing up their presentation.
So do they mean the evidence for 72 genders?
Yeah. Which seems to be a sort of they're on this pathway towards the ludicrous.
Yeah.
With their logic.
The educational system increasingly in these sorts of areas, sexuality, identity, all of these things is becoming absurd, counter science, the opposite of the scientific method. And when you look at the teaching of many of the subjects, I'm sure you've read in the newspapers, you hear it, month by month, there's another story about a given university putting trigger warnings on classic books. You hear that math itself, that somehow math is Western and colonial, and math needs to be decolonized. This is what secular humanistic education is producing. It's producing utter absurdities, not evidence-based.
So it's not really even teaching, as you say, maths or science. It's sort of imposing their ideology on these fact-based, evidence-based subjects.
Yeah, increasingly on the basis of
the very thing, actually, that they're accusing the Christians of doing.
Indeed. On the basis of many various ideologies, generally that come out of a Marxist philosophical understanding, out of the Frankfurt School in Germany in the 30s that impacted the universities in the 1960s especially. These critiques of the West and of Western education and of Western society. This is what is being fed and pumped into young people's minds in the schools today, that their civilization is cruel and worthless, that they are guilty, that everything they've done, their history, their studies, their society, the monarchy, everything, and the Christian church in particular, is a guilt-ridden, cruel and oppressive order, and that even the idea of
quite square with the first 20 minutes you're talking about this, this story of Christian education. So it's actually
even the concept of marriage and family, that these things
are a parody, it's a caricature of the reality of the history even.
And this is what we're seeing pushed in, not from the youngest children in the schools right through. I've got children in university right now, and in their philosophy classes and in their English classes, it's the same stuff. And so the notion that this is evidence-based critical thinking is absolutely absurd. What they're trying, the goal is actually to create a pliable citizen, to be a useful citizen for the state. Not a critical thinker, but actually a religious ideology that drums out of people critical thinking, a sense of their own identity, and actually makes a pliable citizen easily manipulated, easily guilt manipulated into thinking the way the leftist elites, progressive elites that dominate the institutions of learning today want them to think. That's the goal. Let me just say this to you. Probably the most important philosopher of science in the 20th century was Karl Popper. And he pointed out there is no proposition without presupposition. There's no truth claim without a worldview commitment. And so this is not, the way they try and set it up is, over here you've got this evidence-based, rational educational procedure, and over here you've got these loony religious people who want to indoctrinate children in their religious ideas. It's actually it's the other way. It's the other way round.
So this leads us to our next slide, as it were, as Chris Whitty would say. Next slide, please. Separation of church and state. State-funded schools should be religiously neutral and not promote any one religion, particularly if environments funded by taxpayer money. So you seem to be, you're talking about this secular state in religious terms. So how can you separate church and state when the state is already religious, as it were?
Well, the word neutral...
There's a conflict. Yeah, go for it.
The word neutral, neuter, means neither one thing nor another.
Yeah.
So by advocating for a secular humanistic education, you're already denying that principle of neutrality, right? Yeah. There is no such thing as neutrality in any area of life, and certainly not in the field of education. Every subject is going to be approached and taught from a particular paradigm. That's true in mathematics. It's true in for example, math is probably the hardest area to prove the idea that no subject is neutral, right? Because people think, well, 2 + 2 is 4, whoever you are. Yeah. Although we are being told that's colonial math and oppressive math. But actually, there are different schools of mathematics. At the higher you move in your education in mathematics, the more you learn that there are huge differences. This is not the 18th century math of this one fixed idea of mathematics. That idea is gone. And actually, there's no agreement among philosophers about what numbers are. When you ask the most foundational question about mathematics, what is number? They don't agree, because what number is depends on your worldview. We have similar disagreements about at the atomic level, right? In physics, we have similar disagreements in biology. And then of course, as soon as you get to the art subjects, history and literature and sociology and so on, well then the divisions and the distinctions are manifold. That's why you have so many different schools of thought. So the idea of neutrality in education is mythical. All arguments are based on assumptions.
So it's really, don't want to make too much of a moral judgment here, but it is dishonest to suggest, if you're an intelligent person, to suggest that you are neutral, that you're not taking one side when you're so obviously taking a side.
Obviously are. And let's point out too, in the particular objection that you've raised there, that, and they say, separation of church and state. There is no separation of church and state in the United Kingdom. I hope they do realize this, that the Constitution is a Christian constitution. The King just coronated, was swore an oath to uphold the law and gospel of Christ. He's given the scriptures as the gift for princes. He's supposed to rule in terms of the word of God. The reason there was church schools is because there is no formal separation of church and state. Now, I agree with the principle that the jurisdiction of church and state is different, and I actually think that education should be an area of freedom and liberty and shouldn't be controlled by the state at all.
Yeah.
But they don't seem to want that, or the
Yeah.
church. They seem to want the state to control education in terms of their world and life view. So it's them who's actually advocating for religion and state to be bound together in such a way that it eliminates educational freedom. We're not saying that. We're saying that even though this is a constitutionally Christian land, the Christian says, I don't mind if the humanist, the secularist wants to educate their child in secular humanism. That's their child, that's their choice. But in the competition of education in the marketplace of ideas, Christianity beat paganism and it will beat it again. They know this. This is why they don't want faith schools.
Yeah. Should I say yeah? I don't know. We've got to 4 of 9.
Let's speed it up
points.
then.
So let's see how we go on the next one, which is picking up on part of the points that you've made, a freedom to choose. So their argument is secular education ensures that students have the freedom to form their own beliefs without the influence of specific religious doctrines. Is that again being honest? Because I mentioned at the beginning, in Proverbs, and there's actually a debate just over that verse. Is it train up a child in the Christian way or the godly way and they won't depart from it? Or is the meaning of the verse a warning, train up the child in the way they want to go and they won't depart from it? So it's like there's 2 alternatives to that, but both are true in that if you train up a child in an ungodly way, they invariably won't depart from it.
Well, the humanists think of the human mind and the human heart as a tabula rasa, like a blank slate, right? And we just get to we just get to write on it. From the Christian standpoint, the human person is a being made in the image and likeness of God. And
it's a very different starting point.
A different starting point. And actually, the humanist idea is that you have to load that you have to inscribe on that tabula rasa, that blank slate, your ideas. The Christian view is that the child ultimately belongs to God, and that we have an obligation and responsibility to raise that child, to bring that child up, and give them a faithful, truthful education. And because children are sponges, and again, that's why I say the field of education is a battle, is because the child is a sponge. They're not critical thinkers when they're 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, so on. That ability to evaluate critically is something that comes later. And so what you're doing is you're actually, in terms of a given worldview, and this is why it's important to frame this in terms of worldview, it's not religion versus no faith. It's worldview versus worldview. Now, they have the freedom to educate their child or their children in their humanistic, secular worldview. We're seeing the outcomes of that in children today. No sense of identity, a sense of lostness, struggling to discover who they are, academic failure, violence, family breakdown. All of these things are the fruit of...
Funnily enough, in the most recent generation, Gen Z or whatever, or the latest version of it, that the children are turning away from this because they realise the emptiness of it.
Right. Now that's an important point, because this is what is starting to happen. The youngest generation, my children's generation now, are looking at their parents, and in some cases their grandparents, and saying, this isn't right. There's something gone badly wrong here. And so, I was just reading today that the sale of Bibles, especially in the United States, is up massively at the moment. And it's Gen Z, it's the younger generation that are buying them. The point being is that the tabula rasa idea is an illusion. And the very idea of education is that you are bringing ideas, you're raising the child, there's a civilizing process going on, and culture, I mean, in the end, this is a battle over culture too. Culture, cultus, cult, worship. The basic idea is, how do you cultivate the mind of a young person? And it's going to be in terms of one or worldview or another. There's no such thing as a neutral situation. Exactly. So again, it's disingenuous, it's dishonest. They want their worldview imposed on the minds of everyone. We're saying no, parents have the choice as to how they're going to educate their children.
Okay, next point is really in terms of society. So we've got to our original question, which is that it will create a more equal, open and cohesive society.
Yeah.
Will it? Now.
Well, are we a more cohesive society than we were in the 19th century? The early part of the 20th century?
Even the post-war,
even the
early post-war,
even the first couple of decades after World War II. No objective evaluation of Western society, British society would say we're a more cohesive society today, or even equal society today than we were. When we talk about equality, actually, the idea of equality only belongs in the realm of mathematics. The equal sign, these two parallel bars, they are equivalent to one another. But in every other aspect of life, people are different. That's the beauty of life. It's unity in diversity. Some are tall, some are short. Some are smarter, some have different gifts. Some are faster, some are slower. Some are stronger, some are weaker. So the notion that our state secular education is producing a more equal, fairer society is again a myth. In fact, we're seeing quite the opposite emerging in our society. We want equality before the law. That's the fundamental Western tradition in education, is that we're equally made in God's image and likeness, and we're equal before the law. In every other way, human beings are basically unequal.
I'd say, as it's a Christian channel, is that we're equal in that we're born into sin. And there is that dark side, which is there, that everyone has. And if you don't recognize it and the pitfalls connected with it, you're in for trouble as a society.
From the Christian standpoint, we're equally sinful and we're equally in need of redemption in Christ's restorative work. So that's vital.
Children's rights. Now, this is an interesting one. So the next slate coming up is the right of every child to receive a neutral, inclusive education free from potential indoctrination. It's interesting, yes, for years after the Second World War, there was a lot of discussion about parental rights and responsibilities, but it seems in more recent times, it's been quite a global push for that to be, as it were, superseded by children's rights. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, you've basically stated it. That's the issue. This isn't about how much we love children and we don't want them to have an idea imposed on them. They want their ideas imposed on the mind of the child. That's just a move from, we believe, what they're saying is the child has the right to our statist government education that indoctrinates them in a secular humanistic perspective. That's their
And
demand.
on this, they say, well, it's child abuse. In fact, Richard Dawkins has said, and I wrote it in in the write-up for this program, that it is like Holocaust denial to talk about creation. And that's abusing a child.
Well, he's the same guy that said, the theory of evolution is about as much in doubt as that the Earth goes around the sun. This is complete scientific nonsense, and if Dawkins is watching or listening, happy to debate you any time on the subject. I think Dawkins has lost a great deal of credibility. In fact, Dawkins himself has recently said he's a cultural Christian. Now, he recognizes the threat of Islam. He's seeing the decay of our social order. He's recognizing that we're becoming increasingly actually anti-science as the Christian world and life view is decaying. Has been decaying in the West, and the result is that we're globally slipping down the charts in terms of math and science. because of the radical ideologies. Even Dawkins is beginning to recognize this. It was Karl Popper, actually, again, who said that the evolutionary account of reality is a metaphysical research program. He says it's a possible framework for testing scientific hypotheses. He says it's basically a metaphysical idea. Thomas Nagel, the noted philosopher, who is not a Christian, let me just say what he said here. He said of evolution, it's an assumption governing the scientific project rather than a well-confirmed scientific hypothesis. So again, this notion that child abuse is going on in a Christian school, that explains the theories and the hypotheses, evolutionary hypotheses, and then offers a critique of them in terms of intelligent design, perhaps. And there's, of course, numerous books, numerous authors who've written on that subject, that actually the universe shows evidence of design, that it's finely tuned, and so on, and that the cupboard is empty in terms of biochemical evolution and the imagined path from non-life to life. I mean, even Richard Dawkins in the last 10 years or so has been talking about panspermia, the idea that aliens seeded the earth.
Mystical, that's impossible to verify. Yeah, exactly.
Right. This is not tested. This is the important distinction between historical science and operational science. People pick up their cell phone, Tim, and they think, oh, science works. We need to be scientific. Yeah, that is operational science. That's technology. That's not a historical science. The historical sciences are those that are trying to investigate a past that is gone, about which we make hypotheses. And history is the story, really, in a sense, from a scientific standpoint. It's littered with the rubble of abandoned scientific hypotheses as new information.
But they make that a virtue.
Comes to light.
They say, we're the only ones that are humble enough to say we haven't quite reached the conclusion, but we're on the journey.
Of course, on the contrary, it's actually the reason that modern science was born in the lap of Christendom is precisely because there was a recognition that this ordered, created universe is so vast, it contains so much mystery. Let me tell you what Albert Einstein said.
Last one, and then I'll go to the next slate.
Einstein says very clearly, I'm not an atheist. He makes that very clear. He says, probably the most famous scientist of the 20th century, he says, when you're looking at the world, he says, the religious feeling of the rationality or intelligibility of the world lies behind all scientific work of a higher order.
Yeah.
Okay, so secularists are beating on, they're barking up the wrong tree here. Nobody's going to buy this bait and switch anymore, that over here is a neutral education. Actually, what you're getting is indoctrination into an atheistic, humanistic worldview.
So moving on from that, which we sort of touched on, it's secular regulation. Educational authorities, this is what they're arguing for. Ofsted and policymakers should give clearer guidance and stricter regulations, preventing the teaching of creationism in science classes in both state-funded and independent schools. Again, I might answer your question for you, but the point is that that's the only way they can achieve it, is by excluding a debate on the subject.
Yeah.
And Dawkins, doesn't debate everyone, I'm sorry to say.
No, he doesn't.
And so you might be disappointed. And the fact is, even at university level, you're pretty well ostracized if you'll take a view that doesn't conform to this materialistic, sort of universe created itself worldview.
Yeah.
You're out. And by the way, also, about the setting up of schools in the UK. Anything that has any government funding, those involved have to sign a contract to say they will not teach anything to do with the creation hypothesis, and only the evolution hypothesis. So that doesn't sound like an open debate.
Well, of course, when you are insecure in your theories and your hypotheses, you have to ban any critical interaction with them. So it's a mark of the insecurity of the secular humanists now and their worldview that their insistence is this totalitarian insistence they must ban criticism of their theories and their hypotheses. They don't want students thinking critically about those things, even though there's a vast scientific literature now dealing with intelligent design, dealing with the fine tuning of the universe, dealing with all of these things. The notion that Isaac Newton or even an Albert Einstein are non-scientific. In thinking about the idea that a fundamental rationality and intelligence,
lies behind.
The Isaac Newton himself, of course, was basically a Christian. He was slightly heretical on the Trinity, but he was basically a Christian, as were the vast majority of 60% of the scientists of the scientific revolution were Orthodox Christians. 25% were clergy. Only 2% were actually skeptics. So the goal here is they're insecure about.
And they built the modern world. And by the way, we haven't even got onto the Enlightenment, but many had a Christian basis. When the Enlightenment emerged in the
absolutely, there's no question about that. That's demonstrable, and that's been done by the philosophers of science and the historians, the scientific historians. But the goal is to eliminate criticism. Now, if you've got a solid foundation and you believe this is all evidence-based, why won't you allow a critique of those perspectives?
The whole peer review system as well is just completely exclusive.
I've cited Popper, I've cited Nagel. Those men were ostracized for those comments. You could look at Anthony Flew, perhaps one of the most famous atheists of the 20th century, who recently wrote that book on why he now believes in God. And he actually said, "The journey to my discovery of the divine has thus far been a pilgrimage of reason. I have followed the argument where it has led me." They don't want students doing that. So that's a totalitarianism in the realm of the natural sciences. They're conflating a naturalistic worldview, which says everything sprang from nothing, effectively. There was a quantum fluctuation of a vacuum. And from that, we've gone from the goo through the zoo to you. Everything has spontaneously formed and arranged itself. Now that's basically the atheist fairy story. Dawkins admitted evolution made it possible for him to be an intellectually fulfilled atheist. You need this just so story that allows you to account for, or try to account for, human reason, human culture, but they can't. And therefore there's a vulnerability. They know this is a vulnerability, therefore they want to absolutely ban criticism.
Got it. So I bet you're so disappointed that a secular schooling advocate didn't turn up. But I must say I found it a very educational hour that we've just had and a bit. And I'm going to read some of the thoughts from our viewers. This is from Brian. "For me, the word indoctrination speaks of the truth being doctored in a national state school as being meaningless. Therefore, to lie that evolution trumps creation is better than telling the truth, i.e. that the creator actually exists." Thank you, Brian. Catherine writes, "I'm a teacher in a so-called non-denominational school where there is no Christianity of any substance taught other than what teachers download from the Twinkle app website." Never heard of it. But other world religions are recognized and routinely celebrated at assemblies. There are no Bible-based stories, no Christmas plays or stories, no Easter stories, no hymn singing, and no end-of-term church visits. The parish Church of Scotland minister is never invited to the school. When I first started school half a century ago, our primary one-infant class was taught the Lord's Prayer, hymns and carols, and we regularly sang with gusto with our teacher playing the piano. "Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so." Tonight's discussion is so informative. It's not inclusive education, and I, as a teacher, have evidence that I continue to be discriminated against. There is definitely no scope for critical thinking in Scottish primary schools, and Scottish education has regressed beyond recognition. Now, we haven't talked about religious education. I mean, it's the last, as it were, outpost let's say, Christianity in church schools, and yet even in religious education, the humanists want a seat at the table, which is quite revealing, because they have these religious councils, don't they, sacras around the country, and they insist that they have a place at the table to discuss religious education.
Yeah, it's very telling.
Because they're a religion.
Exactly. I mean, that's an acknowledgement, effectively, that theirs is a religious perspective. But it's interesting, you have to remember the way RE is positioned in a school. Religion is reduced to a subject on the curriculum as though it's merely a cultural or sociological phenomenon. So secularism says we're the referee. So you've got these various religious perspectives, and we're going to look at them essentially from a secular worldview standpoint. We're going to try and analyze them culturally, historically, sociologically. Whereas actually religion is a foundation. Do they actually bring their own criteria, their own assumptions, their own worldview into the light of criticism? No, you see, it's the past, it's the fake past that so many in the West and here in Britain accepted and believed, was that secularism was a non-religious worldview perspective, that it was sort of not value laden, that it didn't carry with it core worldview concepts and ideas, and was therefore neutral. And so it then says the state needs to be secular, even though that's not the constitutional arrangement in England, and life is basically secular, education needs to be secular, and oh look, we've got this phenomena of religion that's appeared historically, and we'll treat that as one of the humanities, one of the subjects in the broader school curriculum, not recognizing being self-critical. Actually, it's dogmatic. It's not being self-critical about their own perspective. Whereas historically, it wasn't you were taught RE and Christianity was one option among many. Rather, the Christianity was the foundation, and actually atheism and secularism were the subject of critique. That's the difference. But people have been sold the pass that their kids have had a neutral education. But as one of my friends in America says, if you send your children to Caesar to be educated, don't be surprised if they come back as Romans.
Yeah, that's a very good point. Andrew, Dr. Andrew writes, we don't generally give the surnames, but Dr. Andrew, thank you. You said I was introduced to the Geneva Bible translation about 3 years ago. It is notable for lack of political correctness and not being commissioned by a king. If I am uncertain about what modern translations say, I compare it to the Geneva Bible. There was
strategy.
A lot of scholars involved. Paul says, thank you for yet another great topical programme. Personally, I think you should name and shame the party who withdrew from the debate tonight, not with negative comment, but to hold them accountable and expose their response to Christian challenge, which suggests their awareness of the blatant godlessness and agendas that are opposed to family and truth. All I would say is they are, I'm not going to name them or the person we corresponded with, but they are incredibly active in the corridors of power. So they really do believe in their position and boast of their influence in changing legislation that we all have to live with. So that's how it is. But I think that it all works out for the best, I believe, because we've learnt quite a lot more. And Mr. M says, secular ideas have already ignored God's advice to us because they don't want anyone telling them what to do, and they think there'll be no consistency for their actions. That's an interesting point. Yeah, it's another one here is from a Bill. Thank you for a lovely programme on education. You said it was the Geneva Bible that went to the New World. Yes, that is true, but so did the King James Bible. Geneva is a great Bible, but more fruit has come from the King James Bible. It's another debate.
The King James Bible is a beautiful and marvellous translation. In part, it was commissioned as a response to the Geneva Bible, and its contribution to literature and English literature it's a cornerstone. So they're both important translations. Yeah.
Okay, so I didn't show the last slates. While we were talking about creation, we showed the one on creation. Let's show this one, segregation. Faith schools promote religious discrimination and privilege, which can lead to segregation along religious, socioeconomic and ethnic lines. you've partly spoken about this, but maybe in our final minutes, Dr. Joseph Boots. And by the way, I should say that you are a prolific author. I've read some of your smaller books, but could we say this is a magnus opus, as you call it?
Magnum opus, yeah.
Yeah, magnum opus, The Mission of God, a manifesto of hope for society by Joseph Boots. And it's the 10th anniversary of first publication. It's an epic book, and we're very grateful for you coming here. Now, we've spoken quite a lot about the history, the build-up, the present day, but the arguments that we put in our original debating title and the argument that is made by the secularists is that children are not being prepared for the modern world. How does Christian education prepare children today? Whatever is the next gen after Gen Z, how are they prepared for the modern world by Christian education?
Well, I attended a...
Sorry it's so late to ask you such a question.
I attended a conference recently in London where a lot of politicians and technologists and psychologists and psychiatrists and scientists were speaking. And one of the things that interestingly came across, and it was not a Christian conference, was that the only viable view of humanity left standing in the modern world seems to be human beings made in the image of God. As you get the emergence of things like AI, and as technology, gets more complex and dominates society more and more, who is going to tell us what it means to be human? We've put together some of these the questions this evening from AI.
That's right.
We're leaning on AI as a tool increasingly, and if computers can do your thinking for you, what does it mean to be human? So fundamentally, actually, I would say at a Christian education at the root level prepares us, as it has historically prepared us, for understanding who we are. I mean, the great worldview questions really are origin, meaning, morality, destiny. Who are we? Where are we? Origin. Meaning, what's the meaning of life? How should we live? Morality. What's our compass? And where's it all going? And what guides us in understanding where it's going? I mean, the very idea of history really is an essentially Christian concept. It's a biblical concept. History is not cycles of recurrence, as they thought in the ancient world and they do in Eastern philosophy, but it starts somewhere and it's going somewhere. And actually, secularism has really just de-Christianized or removed the biblical implication of a scriptural view of history. They've just given it a secular meaning and interpretation. Maybe we're going to become post-human.
And they're benefiting from that amazing heritage that you've described brilliantly. But in a world, and we don't have time to fully answer this, but in a world that, or a society that's shut down, pretty hermetically sealed off, secular education from Christian, can you? They accuse us of being segregationist, but how can you fit into a society that is completely rejecting, in the workplace, in the institutions, Christianity? You've got, in the last minute or so, a comment on that.
Well, look, because of the teaching about the nature of human beings in Christianity, it does the opposite of create a discriminatory, separated society. It tells us that we're equally made as God, in God's image and likeness. It actually, this kind of education cultivates an understanding of what it is to value human life from cradle to grave.
So irrespective of the environment, we'll keep arguing, as it were, keep punching, as it were,
for freedom,
our weight.
Yes, and freedom and liberty. We're the ones advocating freedom and liberty in education. We're the ones advocating for the valuing of all human life from cradle to grave. This is what a Christian education does, and it also, because it in the end posits that this is a world of law and order and structure, where we discover the meaning, we guarantee the future of the sciences, of education, of learning. If you have a chaotic world of chance where maybe computers will save you if you can just merge with your own technology, you lose humanity in the mists, in the constant change of the scientific world
Brilliant.
and life view, the secular world and life view.
Isn't it great to have an hour and a half? But even within
could
an hour
use
and a
more.
half, we're out of time, and it's fantastic to have you here, Dr. Joseph Boots. Thank you so much. And to all you out there watching, bless you.